As Ireland marks St. Patrick's Day, the country's national holiday tied to the legend of St. Patrick driving the snakes out of Ireland, it seemed like a fitting moment to revisit one of the more unusual metaphors we've explored on this podcast. In this episode, the Anaconda in the Irish Chandelier, we look at a phrase coined by the scholar Perry Link to describe the subtle but powerful influence of the Chinese Communist Party. Professor Link argued that the party's power works less through direct censorship and more through something quieter, a climate of fear and self-censorship where people instinctively adjust what they say and do. It's a striking image, a giant anaconda coiled silently above the room. Everyone can see it, everyone knows it's there, but no one wants to be the one to point it out. Legend tells us that St. Patrick banished the snakes from Ireland, but by the early 1990s, one very large snake appears to have quietly returned, this time to the Oireachtas. In this special episode of Perspectives with Neilo, we examine how fear of offending Beijing has shaped Irish government behaviour for decades, from Ireland's muted response to China's human rights abuses to its cautious stance on Tibet, Xinjiang and Taiwan. We explore how economic pressure and political self-censorship have influenced policy, limited transparency, and raised serious questions about Ireland's democratic resilience. So, in the spirit of St. Patrick's Day, we're revisiting this conversation. Here is the Anaconda in the Irish Chandelier. In the early 1990s, a group of Dutch business interests sought permission from the Irish government to build submarines at the Cork dockyard in Rushbrook. This location was the previous site of the Dutch-owned Verome Cork dockyard, closed in 1984, having employed over 1,100 people at its peak. The unemployment rate in Ireland in the early 1990s exceeded 15%, yet state papers released in 2022 revealed that the then Minister for Foreign Affairs, David Andrews, declined to support this project. So why did the Irish government reject this opportunity for a major expansion of the shipbuilding industry in Ireland's second largest city of Cork at a time when jobs were so badly needed? From state papers released under the 30-year rule, we know that a letter from a senior official in the Department of Foreign Affairs to the Department of Industry and Commerce in April of 1992 said Minister Andrews regretted that he had to advise against supporting the proposal of reopening the dockyard for several reasons. But top of those reasons was that the export from Ireland to Taiwan of military goods manufactured there would be regarded by Beijing as a highly provocative act, inviting retaliation. Irish government communication from the time also highlighted how China, with 15% of the world's population, was a potentially vast market for Irish goods and services, and also observed that the Chinese Communist Party had not hesitated in the past to make examples of countries which established formal links with Taiwan. It might be surprising to listeners to hear that in the early 1990s, the fear of offending China among Irish government officials was at a level high enough to compel them to forego the creation of over 1,000 much-needed jobs, particularly in light of the adverse publicity associated with the Tiananmen Square massacre, which had occurred in Beijing just a few years earlier in June of 1989. So, how can we understand this fear of offending China, whether it's unique to Ireland, and what are the different ways it manifests in government behaviour? Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Neilo. I'm your host, Neil O'Sullivan. There's a metaphor often used in diplomatic circles when talking about China's influence, the idea of an anaconda in the chandelier. Everyone can see it, everyone knows it's there, but no one wants to acknowledge it because doing so would mean having to act. A US professor by the name of Perry Link coined the term, the anaconda in the chandelier, in a 2002 essay in the New York Review of Books. He is recognised as one of the world's foremost scholars of Chinese language, literature and political expression, and he used this metaphor to describe what he called the pervasive, silent yet deadly threat of Chinese Communist Party control, forcing self-censorship across society, literature and even diplomacy, where individuals police their own speech and actions to avoid unpredictable and sometimes violent repercussions. He says that the Chinese government's censorial authority resembles not so much a man-eating tiger or a fire-snorting dragon, but rather a giant anaconda coiled in an overhead chandelier. Normally, the great snake doesn't move. It doesn't have to. It feels no need to be clear about its prohibitions. Its constant, silent message is, you yourself decide, after which, more often than not, everyone in its shadow makes his or her large and small adjustments, all quite naturally. The fear they experience is not a clear and present sense of panic. It's more of a dull, well-entrenched leeriness that people who deal with the Chinese Communist Party system usually get used to and eventually accept as part of their natural landscape. The controlling psychological power of the fear is what prevails. And this would appear to be what we see in the case of the Verome Cork dockyard. It's unlikely that the Chinese government directly instructed the Irish government not to proceed with the project. Rather, the Irish government's fear of offending China by exporting military components to Taiwan and the potential backlash that could result caused them to self-censor and reject the project, even though Ireland's economy could have benefited from the jobs. Legend has it that St. Patrick banished all the snakes from Ireland. But by the early 1990s, it would appear that one very large snake had quietly found its way back into the Oireachtas, not as a myth, but as a political reality. In this special episode of Perspectives with Neilo, we examine how fear of offending the Chinese government has quietly shaped Irish political behaviour. For decades, Irish governments have tiptoed around Beijing, muting criticism on Tibet, China's human rights abuses, and support for democracies like Taiwan. We examine how this quiet self-censorship has influenced policy, distorted transparency, and raised troubling questions about economic leverage, political openness, and the resilience of Ireland's democratic values. Join us as we explore the Anaconda in the Irish Chandelier. Before we get into some of the examples of China's influence in Ireland, let's first examine how Beijing responds to issues that offend the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. As you may have noted in the case of our opening story on the Verome Cork dockyard, Taiwan independence, or anything that hints at it, is one of the topics that is highly sensitive to the Chinese government. It's known as one of the 3 Ts, the other 2 being Tibet and Tiananmen. In fact, these days, some China watchers say there may be 4 Ts, the 4th being East Turkestan, also known as Xinjiang, in other words, Uyghur human rights abuses. In reality, it's an ever-growing list, and going against the wishes of the Chinese Communist Party is likely to receive a violent backlash. And there are several cases where the Chinese government has made examples of those who fail to comply. Bethany Allen, in her book Beijing Rules, describes how after the Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded Liu Xiaobo the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010, salmon exports to China, an important export for Norway, fell dramatically as fish shipments rotted at Chinese ports for weeks, denied entry due to sudden and unexplained bureaucratic red tape. Liu was a prominent Chinese human rights activist and had been part of the Tiananmen Square democracy protests. Finally, in 2016, after Norway kowtowed by saying that it placed high importance on China's core interests and will not support actions to undermine them, the CCP allowed Norwegian fish exports to resume to pre-Nobel Prize levels. A second example of a CCP backlash took place in July of 2021, when Lithuania agreed that Taiwan could open a representative office in its capital Vilnius under the name Taiwanese Representative Office in Lithuania. This broke with the common European practice of using the name Taipei Representative Office and immediately drew objections from Beijing. China reacted very strongly, calling the decision an extremely egregious act, saying it violated the One China principle, undermined China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and created a false impression of One China, One Taiwan. The ministry demanded that Lithuania reverse the decision and warned of consequences. China subsequently recalled its ambassador from Vilnius and expelled Lithuania's ambassador in Beijing, downgrading bilateral diplomatic relations. Beijing also severely curtailed Lithuanian exports' access to Chinese markets, which impacted Lithuanian products in broader EU supply chains. Lithuanian firms faced difficulties with Chinese customs clearance, prompting concern in Vilnius about economic coercion. In response, the European Union formally launched a case against China at the World Trade Organization and accelerated work on its anti-coercion instrument, aimed at protecting member states from similar pressure in future. WTO consultations between the EU and China failed to resolve the dispute, and diplomatic relations between Lithuania and China remain downgraded. Vilnius continues to stand firm on keeping the office name and expanding ties with Taiwan, arguing that the choice of name reflected respect for Taiwan's identity and sovereignty in a practical, non-diplomatic context, and that it had the right to develop bilateral cooperation, even while saying it still respected the One China policy. There are many other examples of CCP backlashes, and we could create a whole podcast series discussing them one by one. The previous examples of Lithuania, Norway, and the introductory example of Ireland are important because they show how economic leverage, or what Bethany Allen calls China's authoritarian economic statecraft, can be used to influence democratic decision-making, often without public visibility or confrontation. These examples raise a difficult question. When engagement comes with implicit pressure, how do open democracies respond? Or, as one commentator famously put it, how do you deal with the anaconda in the chandelier when no one wants to admit it's there? So, let's take a closer look at how this unspoken pressure has influenced the behaviour of Ireland's political leaders over the past 4.5 decades. There are many historical links between Ireland and China that go back centuries, long before formal ties were established. These include stories relating to Oscar Wilde reviewing translations of Chinese philosophy in the late 1800s, and Ireland's links to British imperialism in China through figures like Sir Robert Hart, a native of Portadown. From the 19th century onwards, many Irish men and women visited China as missionaries, sometimes getting caught up in the turbulent political conditions of the time. In 1930, for example, a Father Sands was captured by communists in Jiangxi province and held for 9 months. During this period of captivity, he met with the communist leader Mao Zedong, with whom apparently he discussed Ireland and its political situation. The People's Republic of China was founded in 1949 after the communists under Mao's leadership defeated the nationalists in the Civil War. But it wasn't until several years later, in October of 1971, that the PRC was recognised by the United Nations. Ireland established diplomatic relations with the PRC on June 22nd of 1979, with embassies opened in Beijing and Dublin the following year. In 1979, the Irish Taoiseach, or Prime Minister, was Jack Lynch. However, his leadership of the Fianna Fáil party faced increasing pressure due to a declining economy, internal party divisions, and criticism over his handling of Northern Ireland policy. Facing a potential leadership challenge and growing disgruntlement from backbenchers, Lynch abruptly announced his resignation as party leader on December 5, 1979. After a short contest, he was succeeded by Charles Haughey, who subsequently became Ireland's new Taoiseach. Charlie Haughey received congratulations from many leaders around the world, including the Dalai Lama, who at the time was both Tibet's spiritual and political leader, living in exile in India. The Dalai Lama, who is internationally recognised as a lifelong advocate of peace and democracy, wrote to offer his felicitations and prayers to Haughey following his election as Ireland's Prime Minister. While it's customary to officially acknowledge such messages of congratulations, the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs advised Haughey that no reply should issue. The primary reason for the snub was the Irish government's concern about upsetting the People's Republic of China, with whom Ireland had recently established diplomatic relations. In contrast to the handling of the Dalai Lama's letter, Haughey sent warm responses to other controversial world leaders at the time, including Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe and Fidel Castro of Cuba. This incident, which came to light years later through the release of state letters and files, is cited as an early example of political caution overriding concerns about human rights in China in Irish foreign policy. But friction over the Irish government's fear of offending China versus standing on the side of freedom and democracy in regards to Tibet wasn't to end there. According to an article by Vincent Brown, published in McGill magazine in 2011, a subsequent visit by the Dalai Lama to Ireland in March of 1991, 2 years after he had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, almost provoked a constitutional crisis. The then President of Ireland, Mary Robinson, planned to defy the government and the Taoiseach Charles Haughey and meet the leader of the Tibetan government in exile at a reception at the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. Such a meeting would likely have been interpreted as an indication of Irish support for the claims of the Tibetan government in exile, as well as a slight to the Chinese Communist Party, which claimed Tibet to be part of the People's Republic of China. McGill reported that a letter from the Taoiseach's office to Mary Robinson said that it wouldn't be helpful if she were to meet the Dalai Lama. However, President Robinson resolved to meet him anyway because she had long been a supporter of Tibetan independence. But this situation did raise the question as to whether or not the President was violating Ireland's constitution, as she was choosing to perform a function in defiance of the government's advice. At the last minute, the crisis was averted as word was sent from the Taoiseach's office that the government was withdrawing its opposition to her meeting the Dalai Lama. On this occasion, it's not clear if there was a response from Beijing, although the Chinese government has a long-established policy of strongly opposing any official meetings between foreign governments and the Dalai Lama, whom Beijing labels a separatist. It is clear, however, that the fear of offending China was the only motivation of the Irish government for wishing to prevent the meeting in the first place. On this occasion, the Dalai Lama informally met President Mary Robinson and was not officially received by the Department of Foreign Affairs. At the time, the Tibet Support Group accused the Irish government of being enslaved to trading links with China, but the Department of Foreign Affairs said the visit was regarded as a private one. A subsequent visit to Ireland by the Dalai Lama in 2011 was also considered to be private and passed off without incident. Xi Jinping visited Ireland as Vice President in February of 2012, and in March of that year, the Irish Prime Minister or Taoiseach, Enda Kenny, visited China. Ahead of Kenny's visit, several human rights organisations in Ireland, including the Tibetan community and Amnesty International, submitted petitions and publicly urged him to raise issues including persecution in Tibet, imprisonment of Tibetan activists, and the repression of religious and civil liberties groups during his visit. However, Kenny's public focus was on emphasising business, trade and investment opportunities between Ireland and China. After the visit, he reportedly reaffirmed Ireland's adherence to the One China policy, with no public statement on human rights. While concerns about the situation in Tibet have been raised in the Irish Houses of Parliament many times in years past, it's interesting to note that officially the Irish government chooses to express concern about human rights conditions in Tibet and elsewhere in China as part of EU-level diplomacy or multilateral human rights mechanisms. For example, in 2013, official written answers from the Irish government indicate that Ireland participated in a declaration with other EU members expressing concern about Tibetan self-immolations and calling for respect for civil, cultural and religious rights, while also stressing respect for China's territorial integrity. More recently, at the UN Human Rights Council in March 2025, Ireland joined a joint statement by 28 European countries expressing concern about deteriorating human rights in China, in particular in Tibet and Xinjiang, and calling attention to treatment of human rights defenders, lawyers and journalists. In recent years, commentators have noted a growing contradiction in Ireland's human rights diplomacy. A careful, often muted tone when it comes to human rights abuses in China, alongside a far more vocal and visible stance on human rights issues elsewhere, a gap that has become impossible to ignore in the context of the war in Gaza. This topic came up when discussing Uyghur human rights in a recent podcast interview with Irish anthropologist Dr. David O'Brien.
And yet when we've gone to the Irish government and when we've tried to raise this with the Irish government, we have been told again and again that the Irish government takes human rights very seriously, but it's not going to engage in a public megaphone diplomacy with China. That's what they've said, that they want to speak to China behind closed doors about it, and that most of these issues will be dealt with at an EU level. And so the conversation is very quickly shut down from what are you going to do to protect these Irish citizens and their families and the broader Uyghur community, to we're doing it, but we do it behind closed doors. And you have to ask the question, why would they use that position? It's so different from Ireland's position towards Israel, where it has explicitly, repeatedly, and quite rightly so, heavily criticized Israel and used almost every international forum to do that. And rightly, and I'm very proud of my government for adopting that position. But why has it adopted a different position towards China, where it says, no, we don't talk about this publicly, we talk in meetings and it's the EU should deal with this? What's the difference there? And it's obvious what the difference is there. It's a trade, a major trade partner. It's the economic power in the world today. And Ireland is very, very important to China economically. So, I mean, it hardly needs a whole lot of explanation as to why Ireland is very reluctant to criticize China. It relies increasingly on Chinese investment in Ireland. Huge Chinese companies have their headquarters in Dublin. Huawei, ByteDance, the company that owns TikTok, these are huge employers now in Dublin. Chinese investment into Ireland is a massive thing. And I am sure that the Irish government are very, very reluctant to criticize China for fear of the economic repercussions.
You can hear the full interview with Dr. David O'Brien in our recent podcast episode entitled The Transparency Trap, China's Closed-Door Diplomacy and the Uyghur Crisis. Yet the influence of the Anaconda in the Irish Chandelier and the fear of economic repercussions appears not only effective at controlling what Irish government officials say publicly about China's human rights abuses, it also seems to work in suppressing Ireland's support for and engagement with like-minded democracies such as Taiwan. And we'll dive into that part of the story after this short break. We'd like to take a moment to thank you for tuning in to Perspectives with Neilo. Our mission is to shine a spotlight on important topics like this one, issues that often go underreported but truly deserve your attention. But to continue bringing these important topics to you, we need your help. If you're enjoying the podcast or finding value in our discussions, the best way to support us is by subscribing or following us on your favourite podcast app. Unfortunately, many of our listeners aren't subscribed yet, and your support can make a huge difference. Join us in raising the awareness, subscribe now, and help us keep the conversation going. And thank you in advance for your support. Now, back to the Anaconda in the Irish Chandelier. If you are a regular listener to our podcast, you will know that we've covered topics related to Taiwan in many of our past episodes. One of our more recent episodes, entitled Why You Should Care About Taiwan, features an interview with Bill Emmott, former editor-in-chief of The Economist, and is well worth a listen. To quickly summarise, Taiwan is an island about half the size of Ireland, located 180 kilometres or so off the coast of China in the northwestern Pacific. The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, claim Taiwan as part of their sovereign territory and have vowed to annex it by force if necessary, although they have never occupied or controlled Taiwan for even a second in their entire existence. Taiwan has its own democratically elected government and is home to over 23 million people. And while political leaders have differing views on the island's status and relations with China, public opinion surveys consistently indicate that Taiwanese people feel more closely aligned with Taiwan than with the People's Republic of China. When it comes to Ireland-Taiwan relations, Ireland does not have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. However, it does have some trade and cultural links. Although in comparison to other EU countries, Ireland is an outlier, which is quite surprising, as you might think that a small island democracy like Ireland, which has fought long and hard for freedom and independence from a bigger, more powerful neighbour, would have a strong empathy with a small island democracy in a similar position on the other side of the world. And you might also think that the Irish government and Ireland's political parties would unanimously voice strong support for a democratic people's right to self-determination, particularly given that this democratic right featured so prominently in the Good Friday Agreement. Unfortunately, the opposite is true. In fact, we can go back to an incident in 2018 when the presence of the Anaconda in the Chandelier at the Irish Houses of Parliament suddenly became very visible in relation to Taiwan. In October of 2018, the then Ceann Comhairle of the Dáil, or Speaker of the House, Seána Farrell, took the extraordinary and unusual step of writing a letter to TDs and senators to warn them that contacts with Taiwan will offend the Chinese government and could damage Ireland's business and diplomatic relations. Mr. O'Farrell said that active engagement between members of the Oireachtas or Parliament and Taiwan was in conflict with the One China policy and was a danger to Ireland's national interest. In his letter, he also said that the growth and expansion of trade with China has been hugely beneficial to Ireland, its economy and its people, and is one of our finest success stories in recent times, and that economic expansion should be nurtured and not even inadvertently undermined. While some might say Seána Farrell's letter was clearly an attempt to weaponise trade with China, it's also important to point out a number of troubling factual concerns with the content of the letter. The first is that he said active engagement between members of the Oireachtas and Taiwan is in conflict to the One China policy. This was not borne out to be true in any of the research we conducted. A paper entitled The Many One Chinas, Multiple Approaches to Taiwan and China, written by Chong Jia-Ian from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, is an authoritative and well-cited source for understanding the complexities and variations of the One China concept. We've linked it in the Dive Deeper section of our blog at pwneilo.com if you'd like to find out more. But to summarise briefly, the One China policy is a diplomatic position whereby a country recognises the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China. There are many different variants of this policy, some countries explicitly stating that they agree that Taiwan is part of China, others acknowledging China's claim on Taiwan but not agreeing with it, like the United States, for example. In the case of Ireland's One China policy and that of 40 other countries, the PRC is recognised as the sole legitimate government of China, but with no explicit mention of Taiwan's sovereignty. It's hard to see then how active engagement between members of the Oireachtas and Taiwan could be in conflict with such a policy. Secondly, Seána Farrell said in his letter that all other EU states, as well as the EU itself, adheres to the One China policy. So in that case, is active engagement between other EU states and Taiwan also in conflict with the One China policy? To answer that, let's listen to a speech that the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission, Joseph Borrell, gave to the European Parliament on the topic of Taiwan in September of 2022.
First message, I think, is clear. No one should unilaterally change the status quo by force in the Taiwan Strait. Second, our One China policy does not prevent the European Union from intensifying our cooperation with Taiwan. And certainly, we have a strong engagement with Taiwan. We have recently modernized this engagement on the economic side. I explained how important is the chips industry of Taiwan for us, how important it is for our supply chain, for our security, for our technology, and other perspectives with export control and investment screening. So we have to continue engaging with Taiwan economically and politically.
So High Commissioner Borrell was pretty clear that the EU's One China policy does not prevent the European Union from intensifying cooperation with Taiwan, a direct contradiction to Seána Farrell's letter. An interesting third point in relation to the letter is the reaction from Irish elected representatives who received it. John McGuinness, Fianna Fáil TD for Carl Kilkenny and chairman of the Ireland-Taiwan Parliamentary Friendship Association, who organises contacts between the Oireachtas and Taiwan, including an annual trip to the country, said that Mr O'Farrell had overstepped the mark. And in a Shannon debate on China's human rights record in December of 2021, Senator Michael McDowell shared his views and some important context regarding the role of the Office of the Ceann Comhairle in relation to Ireland's foreign policy.
Now, the next thing that I just want to mention briefly is the freedom of members of the Oireachtas and of this House in particular to engage in political dialogue and friendly relations with the Taiwan Representative Office in Dublin. It exists here, but it is deeply unfortunate in my view that the Ceann Comhairle, who in his capacity as chairman of the Oireachtas Commission, wrote to members of this House, urging them to bear in mind the damage they would do to Ireland's interests by engaging at all with Taiwanese representatives in Dublin or in having any ongoing political dialogue with them. That's deeply regrettable. But happily, it was purely his own personal decision, and he has no function under the Constitution to tell members of this House, or indeed his own House, what they should and should not do in terms of human rights and foreign policy. And the letter that he wrote made it very, very clear to me as a recipient that the warning was there that I might damage Ireland's national interest by going and seeing a democratic process in operation in Taiwan, that I might damage our trading interests, and I accept that we have very significant trading interests with Taiwan, or with China rather. But that does not mean that I have to avert my eyes or close my mouth on the subject of the abuse of human rights in China.
In the same speech, Senator McDowell also referred to Ireland's lack of presence in the European Trade Office in Taiwan.
And I would say this, that when I was in Taiwan, I spoke to diplomats from many other countries who were stationed there in representative offices. And I also visited the European Union's representative office in Taipei. And the shocking thing was that I was told that Ireland, especially among all the European Union member states, was the one which had least to do with the EU's representative office in Taipei, had closed its trade mission we had there, and was the one country which stood out as being most afraid of in any way crossing the path of the Chinese government by having any visible presence in Taipei or in Taiwan. I think that's shameful. It's really shameful that other members of the European Union have their representative offices there, and that the European Union itself has a representative office there, which we, in effect, boycott. That's sad cowardice.
This sad cowardice Senator McDowell referred to is indeed deeply regrettable. While the Irish government has declined to support the EU's approach of establishing a physical trade office in Taiwan since it closed its office there in 2012, it appears to feel little discomfort in taking advantage of EU cover when it comes to human rights. As we discussed earlier, rather than issuing clear, independent statements condemning China's human rights abuses, as it has done for other regions of the world, Ireland consistently shelters behind collective EU declarations, benefiting from the appearance of principled action without assuming the political risk of speaking out directly. But there's another important aspect to Ireland's lack of engagement with Taiwan. During a visit to Taiwan in July of 2025, Ireland's current Las Ceann Comhairle and chairman of the Ireland-Taiwan Parliamentary Friendship Association, John McGuinness, met with Taiwan's president, William Lai. In President Lai's press release after their meeting, he referred to the fact that the Irish government launched its national semiconductor strategy earlier in May, and he added that, going forward, Taiwan and Ireland can bolster collaboration so as to upgrade the competitiveness of our respective semiconductor industries. Together, we can help build a values-based economic system for democracies. In a recent podcast episode entitled Too Afraid to Trade, I spoke with Deputy John McGuinness and put it to him that President Lai's offer seems like a remarkable opportunity for Ireland's semiconductor industry to collaborate with the world's top semiconductor manufacturer.
It's an open invitation from President Lai, and it's ignored by the Irish government. Now, that's successive governments, and they cling on to this outdated policy, which I think needs to be reviewed. And I have also argued that because Ireland is small in terms of Europe and Asia and Taiwan, there is a need for us to strengthen our collaboration with the other European countries so that as a European Union, the policy would be we trade in Taiwan, we have a presence in Taiwan, and the semiconductor business is expanding rapidly, and Taiwan is now playing a role in Europe. We weren't at the table to ask for the location of that particular manufacturing plant to be in Ireland. Germany was. They were there, actively involved, and they got the plant. We met many universities when we were out there on this occasion, and I was struck by the collaboration between universities within Taiwan and then between Taiwan and other European countries, sharing the cutting-edge developments that are taking place not only in semiconductors but in education and in general trade and what society is now looking for in terms of general technologies. And I was struck by how advanced they are and how advanced education is in Taiwan. We have so much to learn from them. And there is an interchange in place between Taiwan and Ireland in terms of students. So we're not taking advantage of that at all in terms of sending our students to Taiwan so that they can experience that firsthand what is happening at the coalface of these developments. And that saddens me. But there's a top-down approach in Ireland in terms of policy and supporting that, dated position in relation to Taiwan. And it's for our political leaders to, I think, embrace the developments through Europe that are taking place in establishing a firm on-the-ground relationship with Taiwan. And that policy of preventing that has to change radically.
There can be no doubt from what we've heard here, but that Ireland as a country is losing out, particularly in the area of semiconductors, by not building stronger commercial and educational links with Taiwan. From what we know at the time of recording, neither the IDA nor the Irish government have made any formal response to President Lai's offer. As was the case with the Verome Cork Dockyard project in the early 1990s, we may have to wait another 30 years to find out whether the Anaconda in the Chandelier or the Irish semiconductor industry wins this one. So far in this episode of Perspectives with Neilo, we've shared examples of how the Irish government's fear of offending the Chinese Communist Party has quietly shaped Irish political behaviour over the past 4.5 decades. We've shared examples of how Irish political leaders have snubbed Tibetan dignitaries, muted their criticism of human rights abuses in China, and failed to fully adopt the EU approach when it comes to supporting economic links with the island democracy of Taiwan. We've also seen how the government's fear has led to rejection of significant economic opportunities, and we've asked whether this caution has come at a cost to Ireland. The examples we've shared, of course, are only a sample. There are many other similar cases which we will likely return to at some point in the future, like, for example, the presence of Confucius Institutes in Irish universities, which has been a source of controversy, with academics and critics raising concerns about academic freedom and the potential for these institutes to advance Chinese Communist Party interests. A quick search reveals that more than 10 European countries have closed at least one Confucius Institute or classroom since 2019. Meanwhile, Confucius Institutes continue to operate at 3 Irish universities. Another example is related to surveillance technology procurement. A 2025 investigation revealed that thousands of controversial surveillance cameras made by a Chinese firm were installed in various Irish public sector locations, including local councils and hospitals. This occurred despite international security warnings, with many local authorities stating they had not received specific government security advice against their use. The presence of a Chinese supplier's telecom equipment in Irish telecom networks is also an issue and another topic deserving an episode of its own. Across Europe, more than a dozen EU states have moved to ban or phase out Chinese suppliers' equipment from their telecom networks, citing national security risks. Countries like Sweden, Lithuania and Romania have taken decisive action. Ireland, however, has not. There is no outright ban on Chinese equipment. Instead, the government has quietly introduced legislation allowing it to restrict so-called high-risk vendors without naming any vendors directly. As a result, Chinese suppliers' equipment remains in parts of Ireland's telecom infrastructure, while the government shelters behind EU frameworks rather than taking a clear national position. Once again, Ireland chooses caution, ambiguity and silence when faced with the Anaconda in the Chandelier. In recent months, warnings of Chinese influence operations have grown louder, with reports of Chinese spies attempting to infiltrate the Oireachtas, closed-door Oireachtas meetings with CCP officials, and the National Cybersecurity Centre warning of forces aligned to states like China and Russia, which they say pose a significant threat to Ireland's national security. As Ireland looks ahead to holding the EU presidency in July 2026, we must ask whether the Anaconda in the Chandelier will still be allowed to loom unspoken over the Oireachtas, shaping policy through fear rather than open, transparent debate. And if so, what will it take for a modern-day St. Patrick to step forward, call it what it is, and finally banish the snake from Ireland's democracy for good? Because history remembers those who banish the snake, not those who pretend it isn't there. We hope you've enjoyed listening to this special episode of Perspectives with Neilo, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you think the Irish government should respond to the Anaconda in the Chandelier? Do you think the Irish government should be more outspoken on China's human rights abuses? Do you think Ireland should be more supportive and engaging with democracies like Taiwan? And do you think we need better transparency in how our democracies engage with authoritarian regimes like China? We'd love to hear your feedback. Drop us a comment on our Perspectives with Neilo social media pages or whichever app you use to listen to the podcast. You can also contact us via our blog at pwneilo.com. Also, if you enjoyed this episode and you don't want to miss any future episodes, we'd really appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe or follow button. This is the best way to support us and really helps motivate us to keep producing content. But that's where we leave it for now. Thank you for listening and for all your support, and until the next time, Slán agus beannacht.